pretend I hate it. Pretend. Thank you all. It's so lovely to see you, and some new faces and some lovely, I've got to say old ones, you know what I mean, some familiar faces. So Max normally does the hello and welcome, but I'm doing that this evening. And so thank you, seriously, all for coming, and I really hope you enjoy it. I'm just like, oh my God, the pressure. I mean, obviously they're always amazing, but let's really hope that you do enjoy this one. Nothing like a bit of death to bring out the local interest. So I was like, I've got sex cells, but clearly it's death, and the more gruesome the better. And it's a slight departure. You know, I've done cotton mills, coal mines, Park Bridge, you know, lots of really interesting local stuff. The breweries one was quite popular. And I just fancied doing something just a little bit different this time, because, you know, there's a lot of really interesting stuff, but obviously I brought the history to it as well, you know, so you are going to learn some historical facts tonight. So I'll go through the agenda in a second, but just a couple of things, just like a reminder for those who may know, but to let people know who don't. So obviously this is the community centre. It's not just me, obviously, you know, I'm here first Thursday of every month, put it in your diaries. But the community centre is open on Mondays and Wednesdays between 9 and 1. Drinks, there's snacks, some hot food. Mags runs a chair exercise class.
I don't run it, I did that once, never again.
Mags organises a chair exercise class Thursdays 1 till 2:30 and Friday 1 till 3 is bingo, and that's a lot of fun, it really is. I'm here first Thursday of every month, and on the 23rd of September there is the first police surgery. So that's just, you know, anything local concerns, there will be a representative here for you to have a chat with, and if it's well represented, they will make it a regular thing. So just some dates for your diary. But that is that. We will crack on with all things death in Oldham. But first, this has nothing to do with death, but lovely Roy gave me lots of books to do with Oldham history, and I've been reading through them, and there's this brilliant book, which is like tales of Oldhamites, Oldhamites does sound a bit wrong. Oldhamers, who are like born in the 1910s, 1920s, just sharing their stories of their childhood, and it's a brilliant, brilliant book. But I'm obviously not Northern. I am, I hope, an adopted Northerner. I've lived here over 20 years, but I do love Oldham folk, and I love how rock hard each and every one of you is. And there is a story here. This is a lady, I think this is from the 20s, and she said, I was 4, my sister was 17 months younger. She was a happy child, starts to walk at 15 months, and she was knocked down by a car on the corner of Hadfield Street and Coster Hill Road. That put her off her feet. Then she got ill, and the illness knocked her back further. Dr. Atlas said to my mother, there's nothing wrong with her, Lily, she's just lazy, can't be bothered walking. And I was like, that's a proper Northern 1920s childhood. There's nothing wrong with her, she's just lazy. Knocked down by a car at the age of 17 months. But honestly, I loved it. There's so many lovely things in there. However, let's move on to the main event. Curious Tales of Death in Oldham. So here's the agenda. I do always just like to give you a quick flavour. So we've got a quick journey to the 13th century. The Bardsley bookshop murder. Spoiler alert, it's not set in Bardsley. Okay. Sorry, everyone gets up and leaves now, like, get a call. Got the Buller Jacks murders. Some of you may be aware of that one. Interesting, it's not all murder. We've got a couple of ghosts. So we've got the Scottish play, The Haunting of Bircham Bower. A little bit about, there was an attempted murder, a little bit about transportation. Masters of Execution we will come on to. And then there's a grave in Bardsley in Holy Trinity Churchyard that I've wanted to get into one of my talks for a year now, and I've finally managed to zhuzh him in. So we will be finishing just with a little bit about a local lad and an act of heroism, and he's in the graveyard. All right? So we're going to start with 13th century justice. So one of the earliest references to an unusual set of circumstances regarding a death in Oldham that I found dates back to 1245. a lady called Mabel de Parbold, originally a Wigan lass. She accused two men, Adam Dunn and Gilbert Knight, of murdering her husband Albin and her son Richard in Crompton. The two men were arrested and taken before a jury in Lancaster, taken before a court in Lancaster, and they went for a jury. Now, it turns out that husband and son had been caught stealing oxen and cows, and as punishment, they were beheaded by Adam and Gilbert. They were apprehended, nicking their cows, and so they lopped off their heads. So clearly Mabel's like, not really very keen on that. Can we go to court? I want some justice for this. However, the jury felt this to be a reasonable consequence of stealing cattle, and so Adam and Gilbert were found not guilty and they were released. And this is true, this is fact, this is recorded in the court annals of the time. And to be fair, cattle rustling was one of the most common crimes in England, in medieval England, and it was always heavily punished, you know. So it wasn't necessarily punished by death, but it would have been something painful or expensive or both. You would be punished quite severely. And if the husband and son had been caught stealing cattle before, then, you know, they paid with their lives, and very few people besides the widow and mum would have actually felt there was anything wrong with that. So, you know, sad for Mabel, then was definitely the breaks in the 13th century. But we're now going to move forward to 1913, the Bardsley bookshop murder. So this is a gentleman called Daniel Wright Bardsley. He was a successful Oldham businessman. He had a book and stationery shop. It was at 43 Yorkshire Street in Oldham. That no longer exists. It was situated next to Radcliffe Street, which became St Mary's Way, and then when the road was widened, that part was all demolished. So, Saturday, the 26th of July, Daniel stayed at the shop with his two assistants till 10 p.m. I was like, making them work, earn their money, clearly. And at 10 p.m, there's two assistants left, and a passing night watchman, a couple of hours later, walked past, saw everything was locked up, you know, nothing to see here, everything's fine. He came back, his name was James Greaves, and he came back a couple of hours later and noticed, well, actually, now the door's unlocked. So he thought, that's a bit strange. So he tried to go in, and he couldn't sort of really open the door, and he looked down and he saw a body on the floor of the shop. So he rushed off to the town hall, where the police were located, and they came back and they got in and they found Daniel Bardsley deceased. They found a wooden Indian club and an iron dumbbell on the floor, covered in blood and hair, and they managed to work out these were probably the murder weapons. So 1913, don't worry, it's not a photo, but they had like illustrated news articles, and so this is the scene. As was found, so we've got the dumbbell in the hand, so there's poor Daniel Bardsley lying dead in his bookshop. So the money he'd had on him had been stolen. It was about 20 shillings the day's takings, and he also had purchased that day 6 gold rings, and they disappeared too, and they're important. So naturally thoughts turned to, well, who's done this? Who's done it? And very quickly, the name of 17-year-old Edward Hilton was mentioned. So Edward had been an errand boy for Daniel Bardsley, but he hadn't been a very good one, so he'd actually just been let go. And literally only been employed by him for a few weeks. So potential grudge as a motive. So they rounded Edward up, and they quickly arrested him, and he implicated his friend, a 20-year-old man called Ernest Kelly, who worked at Platt Brothers Cotton Mill in Oldham. And he was arrested for murder too. So those gold rings were found on each of their persons, Edward and Ernest. So they both confessed to being at the bookshop, but blamed each other for actually committing the murder. So they went to court, and because it was impossible to differentiate, you know, between these stories, who done what, they were both found guilty and they were both sentenced to death. But the judge recommended mercy based on their youth, and he also noted that the 20-year-old Ernest appeared more genuinely sorry for his actions, and he felt that Ernest was more truthful with his version of events. But they were both taken strange ways and held there awaiting their execution date. But Edward, the 17-year-old, he was reprieved. His sentence was commuted to a prison sentence. this mercy was not extended to 20-year-old Ernest, and people were outraged, really, really outraged. Edward was 17. Now, at the time, the legal age for hanging in the UK, in England and Wales, was 16. But in the 20th century, nobody under the age of 18 was hanged at all. And so because of his age, and because he was felt to be mentally unfit to really understand perhaps what had happened, he had the mercy of having his sentence changed to imprisonment instead. So, but Ernest is still sentenced to hang. And it wasn't just Oldham, across the country people were up in arms about this. They felt that actually the younger lad was more guilty than Ernest, and there were mass meetings held in Oldham to protest this decision. They demanded equal treatment for both of them. If one's reprieved, the other needs to be reprieved too. And there was a meeting at Salvation Army Citadel on Union Street. 30,000 people attended that to protest that Ernest was not getting a reprieve too. And Sarah Lees, you may remember my talk last month about women and suffrage. She was Mayor of London, Mayor of Oldham at the time, and she was present. She had actually written herself to King George V, asking him to extend mercy to Ernest. But because it was unsuccessful, she was quite severely heckled at this meeting of 30,000 people. The case went to MPs, it went to the Home Secretary, it went to Queen Mary, demanding, asking for, begging for mercy for Ernest as well. But it wasn't overturned, and he was hanged on December 13th, 1913. The night before, up to 50,000 protesters met in Oldham and marched to Strangeways. They smashed the town hall windows as well. Clearly that's something to do with something, but they marched to Strangeways the night before to protest, but it didn't matter. At 8 o'clock the next morning, he was hanged. Apparently very brave, shook hands with everybody. And Edward, the 17-year-old, he served his time in prison, and he was released in September 1933. And the thing is, they were found guilty of murder, whatever the degree of involvement. They both admitted to being there. So I'm not saying, oh, the poor lads. I'm saying poor Daniel Bardsley, he was the one that was murdered. They blamed each other, but they both admitted they were there. And, so we have our own thoughts about guilt and appropriate punishments. And I don't wish to portray them as these innocent lads. However, this is a genuine photo I'm going to show you, taken of the two friends just a few days before the murder took place. It's just this two lads larking about playing at cowboys. I don't know which one's which, but it is a genuine photo that I found of them. And it's just two lads, I know Ernest was 20, but young guys having fun, and it's such a dreadful shame, that something happened that turned them into murderers, But we're now going to go back a further 80 years to an infamous crime committed in Sutherland.
Can I just say, I think it's really funny that
I know.
enthusiast walks in.
And just to be clear, these murders are historic, okay? They're all historic. It just started in 1245, so, it's like, there's a death in Oldham. What's going on at that community centre? So, in the early 19th century, a gentleman called William Bradbury, known as Bill, and his wife, lived in a farmhouse on Saddleworth above Greenfield. And in about 1810, there was a new road being built between Greenfield and Holmfirth. And their farmhouse was about 100 yards from the new road. And clearly, not a man to miss an opportunity, Bill applied for and got a licence to turn the farmhouse into an alehouse. And he called it the Shooter's Arms. So there's going to be lots of thirsty travellers on that road. What can we do to earn a book? Turned it into a pub. And their son Tom lived nearby with his wife and family in Sidebank. And when Mary died in 1828, Tom moved in with his father. He'd separated from his wife to help him run the alehouse, because Bill was now in his 80s. So the alehouse was now called the Cherry Tree, but it became known as Billow Jack's. And there was one more future name change, but the name Billow Jack's really stuck. And why Billow Jack's? I didn't know this. An old, I I think maybe local or northern, naming custom at the time referred to people by theirs and their father's names. So William, Bill, was the son of Jack, so he was Billo Jack. And his son Tom was Tomo Bill. And so because it was Bill's pub, it was Billo Jack's pub. And if you didn't know that, now we all do. So on the evening of Monday, April the 1st, 1832, Tom, the son, left the alehouse with his friend Reuben Platt, to go and do some shopping in Greenfield. And Reuben later stated that on their way into Greenfield, they passed by 3 Irish labourers. Tom briefly spoke to one of them. They'd asked the way to Holmfirth, and afterwards he said to Reuben that he knew that one, that he'd previously robbed his father, he'd previously robbed the farmhouse. And he was a bit uneasy about leaving Dad alone in the farmhouse while he went into Greenfield, but he was like, it's fine, it's all good, what's the worst that's going to happen, going to Greenfield. So they did, he and Reuben parted ways, all end of. The following morning, Tuesday the 2nd of April, 12-year-old Amelia Winterbottom, who was Bill's granddaughter and Tom's niece, went to the farmhouse to get some yeast from her grandfather, and she found a really badly beaten body downstairs. And she went upstairs and found her grandfather, again severely injured. He was lying in bed upstairs. So she rushed to the nearest house about half a mile away to get help. And when they came back, they discovered it was Tom. She hadn't even recognised her uncle, who was very, very badly beaten. So at the time he was 46 and Bill was 84, and so they were both found alive, although Tom never regained consciousness and he died later on that afternoon at about 3 o'clock. They found various weapons covered in hair and blood, a fire poker, a spade, a broken pistol, and the farmhouse had been ransacked, and to quote a newspaper report at the time, anything of any value was taken away in the robbery. So Bill, the elderly gentleman lying in bed upstairs, he drifted in and out of consciousness and he died at about 1 o'clock the following morning. However, witnesses said he did mention at least once one word, Pats or Plats. Apparently at this time, Pats was a term that referred to Irish people. And obviously there were a few in Greenfield, as I said, they were working on the road and they'd passed a small group of Irish people that Tom had recognised. It could have been Platt, Reuben Platts, who Tom had gone into Greenfield with, knowing that Bill's alone in the farmhouse. So an inquest was held at the William IV public house in Greenfield, which returned a verdict of murder by persons unknown. There was a £100 reward offered, never claimed. No one was ever held to account for these murders. So Tom had bought some candles in Greenfield and they were found still in his pockets when his body was found. So they surmised that he'd basically got home, disturbed whatever was happening, and then suffered the consequences of it himself. But obviously, you know, with the passing of almost 200 years, it's unlikely we're ever going to actually know what happened. But there were suspects. So I said, Bill may have said Pats, referring to the Irish, and quite a random Irishman was found loitering in Greenfield the next day, so they arrested him. They're like, you're Irish, you must have done it, in you come. But nothing further came from that line of inquiry, and they duly let him go. And Reuben Platts was questioned as well, but again, they didn't find anything. There was no gold rings on these murder suspects, so he was let go as well. My money's on this pair. A local father and son duo, Jamie and Joe Bradbury. Now, same surname, but I've not been able to, I couldn't tell if they're particularly, I don't think they were like a particularly direct relation to Bill and Tom. Very interesting. So Jamie and Joe had been taken to court by Tom for poaching on his father's land, on Bill's land. And the court case was set for Tuesday the 2nd of April, the day the bodies were found. Jamie had been heard to say that Tom wouldn't testify, and he didn't. So, at the court case on the 2nd, Tuesday the 2nd, Tom didn't turn up, due to being almost dead. So Jamie and Joe were acquitted. They were set free. You know, if he's not going to bother turning up, you can go. But once news of the attack became known, they were immediately brought back to court because it just seemed like a rather marvellous coincidence that this had happened, but they were given a very solid alibi by the daughter and sister. So, you know, that she gave a very solid alibi, so they were let go. And then there was a twist. I found this really remarkable detail. So 20 years afterwards, in the 1850s, there was a gentleman called Robert Whitehead who lived in Australia, and he was writing to his brother in Huddersfield. And he told a story in this letter about a man he'd met prior to that man being hanged for murder in Hobart, Tasmania. And the man had confessed to the murders of Bill and Tom. To this Robert Whitehead, he said he only meant to rob the farmhouse, but Bill got in his way, so he attacked him to get him out of the way. Then Tom came home and he attacked him too. Now, I only found one reference, and I don't know the name of the person who was hanged, but it does seem awfully odd that a murderer being hanged in Tasmania 20 years later knew about this story, apart from anything else. You know, we didn't have social media or 24-hour news coverage. So you don't know, you never know. So the alehouse was taken over by Augustus Bradbury, that was Tom's son, and by 1840 it had been renamed the Moorcock. So the pub remained until it was demolished in 1937. So this is a photo of the Moorcock around 1905, and I like these photos. So this photo shows the site of the alehouse in the 1930s. And this is a photo from the same site now. Just showing, that's not my photo, I have to say, but it's quite eerie, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just there,
Yeah.
and now it's completely gone. But if you go in, apparently it's private land, but it's owned by like a water board or something, so who cares? And you can go in, and apparently the cellar's still there. Oh, I shouldn't say that. No, stay off water board land. But the cellars and whatever that you can still see. So I am going to get up there. I'm going to take the dog. She's good at seeing ghosts, my dog. So I'm going to get her to go up there and see something.
The grave is in Sutherland
Yes,
Church.
yes, it is.
Have you seen it?
I've not been up there, but no, yes, and it's like the gravestone is basically, these men were murdered. They're not messing about.
It's just a flat one. We were looking at it the other week.
Yeah,
Right in the corner.
it's not like go gently into the good night, it's murder. You know, so no, I will get up there. Okay, so we've had a couple of gruesome murders. So I'm going to hopefully lighten the mood maybe just a little bit. So I've got a tale of how you break a superstition actual peril. Okay. So let me introduce you to a Mr. Harold Norman. Never say Macbeth. And I'm sure many of you will be aware it's a very deeply held superstition that you never say that word inside a theatre. I think we're safe here. I think we're okay here. You refer to it as the Scottish play instead. Very firmly believed by thespians. And all who work in theatre land. So it's said to cause very bad luck, and there are many examples of this. Oh, yes, you all know about that, won't you?
It's very true.
It is, yes, there we go. Theatre land connection with us tonight. And there are many examples. So apparently the actor playing Lady Macbeth died on the opening night of the play itself in 1606, and apparently Shakespeare himself stepped in to play Lady Macbeth. In New York, in 1849, there were two opposing productions of Macbeth being staged at the same time, and there was a real rivalry between the two actors, and this led to a riot which left 20 people dead. This is true. This is historical fact. This is what you came here for. Laurence Olivier was starring in a 1937 production at the Old Vic, and he had a very narrow escape with a piece of falling stage equipment. So the roots of the apparent curse, I love this, lie with the coven of real-life witches who took offence at the way Shakespeare depicted them in the play. We're not like that. All right, so they cursed the play. Don't know if that's historically accurate, but I like it. So that's why it's in the talk. So we can agree that the play has an air of mystery and a whiff of danger surrounding it. Now there is a remedy. Do you know the remedy? If you say Macbeth in theatre? No. Okay. So what you have to do, you have to immediately leave, be gone. You have to go outside, turn around 3 times, spit on the floor, swear loudly, then knock on the door and ask to be let back in. I don't make this stuff up, this is historical fact, Lucy, okay? But probably best just don't mention the name. However, enter Mr. Harold Norman. He was starring in a production of Macbeth at Oldham Coliseum in January 1947. Clearly non-superstitious, he uttered the word that shall not be mentioned and was unrepentant. He was like, what eggs? He did not follow the aforementioned remedy to avoid misfortune, evidently quite blasé about what he'd done. But he did not have much time to regret his actions. During a fight scene, he was stabbed by the actor playing Macduff with a prop sword that turned out to be a genuine blade. And he was taken to hospital where he died the following month of peritonitis. This is historical fact, people. It's true. He died. He was wounded with a dagger and died of peritonitis. So, I'm not saying that the curse is real, but I think Mr. Harold Norman probably believes it. But apparently he's not too keen to leave the scene of his accident. He reputedly haunts the Coliseum to this day, but only on Thursdays, the day he was stabbed, and I do like a very specific haunting. I like that. And now that the Coliseum is going to be reopened, I am definitely going to get down to a Thursday performance to see if I can spot him wandering around. So we've covered unnatural deaths, and I'm going to now talk about a lady who died of completely natural causes. But she had some very unnatural ideas about what she wanted to happen after her death. Okay, I think you're going to enjoy this. So the fear of being buried alive, it's a real fear, it's an ancient fear, it really is, and it's known as taphophobia. That may come up on a pub quiz, you never know. Taphophobia, fear of being buried alive. And it was a real concern through the 18th century in this country, turning into a genuine worry and preoccupation in the 19th century. In 1895, a physician called J.C. Owsley claimed that around 2,700 people were buried alive each year in England and Wales. Another doctor at the time disagreed and said it was only about 800 people a year. So you're fine, you're fine. Either way, that's enough premature burials to get Victorian people worrying. So, to avoid this fate, many special devices were invented to stop this happening to you. So, safety coffins, they are a thing, and they did a massive business in the 19th century, okay? So, you could have a bell. This is true. This is fact, okay? So if you wake up in your coffin, you ring the bell and hope someone's nearby. It's true, honestly. Or, this one I'm not sure how well they thought it through. It's a lid that opens from the inside. But if you're 6 foot under, oh, hello Earth. I'm not entirely sure how much that would have worked. And there is no single record of any safety coffin saving a life. Okay? But this preoccupation clearly was something that worried a lady called Hannah Beswick. Now, she was born in Manchester in 1688 and lived in a manor house called Birchen Bower in Hollingwood. Do any of you remember the Ferranti factory? On the site of where the Manchester Evening News printing press is now by Mozzers. That is the site of her manor house, Birchen Bower. That's where it was. Okay? And it was demolished in the 1930s. And there we go, Ferranti and now Manchester Evening News. So Hannah, a well-to-do lady of considerable means. And genuinely, again, this is historically accurate, her family had a scare a few years before she died in 1758 when her brother, John, was declared dead and prepared for burial. As the coffin lid was being closed, someone noticed his eyelids flickering and thought, maybe we should get a doctor. Dr. Kane said, no, not dead. She's not dead. So he was taken out, placed in bed, and he recovered a few days later and apparently lived for many years afterwards. Okay, so maybe he'd be like ringing that bell. Please. So this near miss apparently really scared Hannah, and she apparently then left some very interesting instructions following her own death to avoid a similar fate happening to her. So her personal physician was a chap called Charles White, and it is documented she left him a considerable amount of money in her will, apparently with the following details of what to do with her body after death. Charles was to embalm her body, leaving only her face exposed, and he was to keep her body at his home in Manchester, and he was to return her body to her old home every 21 years. Didn't say how long for. Now, I say this is well documented, and it is, because you can find all that information online. But if you then look at Hannah's will, it doesn't have any of that in it. But she did leave her doctor £400, which is the equivalent of £68,000 today, for him to arrange her funeral. So, I don't know basically what she wanted that £68,000, but Marcus, take note. I would like that spending on my funeral, please. Okay, that is going to be a serious send-off. Okay. So clearly Hannah was anticipating being buried. She's left £400 for her doctor to arrange it. She did not, in her will, specify, can you mummify me and keep me in your house, please? But there could have been a separate, letter of intent. We don't know that, okay? What we do know, he did follow these instructions, okay? Maybe he thought, bit of a loophole here, I'll take the money for a funeral, but if I keep her above ground and don't arrange a funeral, I get to keep that money, you know? But I do know that hers was not the only body he had. He had quite a collection of curiosities. He had the skeleton of a highwayman in his house in Sale. Yeah. That's Sale, not Sale. The Mars. And then a skeleton of a man that had been hanged for burglary. So quite the collection. Absolutely not weird in any way. No red flags there whatsoever. You know. How many bodies you got, Charles? Just three. Just three. So the exact reasons for her mummification have been lost in time. But what's not disputed is that this did happen after her death. She was mummified, she was kept at Charles's house, apparently inside a clock case, and visitors used to go and say hello to her. When he died in 1813, her body went to another doctor, Dr. Ollier, and when he died in 1828, her body went on display at the Museum of Manchester Natural History Society and was later given to Manchester University. In 1868, it was decided enough is enough. She's been dead 150 years. She's been above ground too long. So, and I love this, the Bishop of Manchester came, inspected her, and declared she was irrevocably and unquestionably dead. I love it. You know, as a patient, you've got to make sure, haven't you? It's just like, give her a prod. Can you hear us? I've been dead 150 years, no, I can't. And so preparations were made for her to be buried, but there was one last obstacle. In 1837, the law had changed in England and Wales that you couldn't be buried without a death certificate. Well, she's been dead for 150 years. The doctor who declared her dead is no longer. So they had to appeal to Parliament to get the Home Secretary to get permission for her to be buried. But she was. And she was buried at Harper Hay Cemetery on the 22nd of July 1868 in an unmarked grave. Bless. I can relax now. So, but where does the haunting? Remember, this is the haunting of Bertram Bower. So it seems that shortly after she died, an apparition started being seen, like I said, in the manor house that was here, in a black gown and a white lace cap, reputed to be Hannah, restless and unhappy that she's been kept in a clock case. I mean, it's not funny, but it is. So maybe she wanted to be buried, and she was just unhappy and she couldn't rest. But to be fair, if that was me, I'd have haunted him. I'd have been going woo around his house to say, get me 6 foot under, please. And the apparition continued to be seen after her house was demolished, and there is reports stating that she was seen at the Ferranti factory in 1981. So maybe she is still roaming the grounds of the Manchester Evening News printing press, although knowing the Manchester Evening News, if there was the whiff of having seen her, there would have been a story. So you never know. But yeah, so next time you're driving down there, if you're going to Morrison's or heading onto the motorway, have a look, because apparently she appears at windows. So don't crash. Okay, so moving on to my next tale then. So attempted murder and transportation. So transportation from Britain and Ireland to Australia started in 1787 and was a punishment through to 1868. Prior to 1787, transportation was used, but instead of Australia, convicts went to America, to the British colonies in North America, but a small matter of North America declaring independence from Britain in 1776, and by the way, stop sending us your convicts, please. Put a stop to that, so Australia seemed to fit the bill nicely. So crimes that resulted in transportation were most commonly thefts, including pickpocketing, shoplifting, cattle rustling, and highway robbery. Now, prior to transportation, most of those crimes, pickpocketing included, carried the death penalty in England and Wales. So at one point in British history, and it was known as the Bloody Code, there were over 200 crimes that got you the death penalty, okay? And by the early 19th century, judges were becoming just a little bit more enlightened. It wasn't just, off with their head for nicking a handkerchief or something. And because they felt, the death penalty is a bit too harsh for this, so transportation was used an awful lot instead. So around 162,000 people from Britain and Ireland were transported to Australia, and so they would serve a period of servitude in that country, and after that time, you're free to return home at your own expense. Prohibitively expensive for by far the majority of people. So they stayed in Australia and built a life there. And for many years, it was a source of shame for Australians to have a convict in their past. But actually, nowadays, it's like a really cool thing in Australia, and they go trawling through their family histories going, get in, we found one. What was it there for? I don't know, stole a lace handkerchief or something, it doesn't matter. So I don't know how many of those 162,000 were for Oldham, but I do know a chap called John Griffiths was one of them in 1840. So earlier that year, a widow called Hannah Hall, aged 72, and she was found badly beaten at her home in Roynton by concerned neighbours who'd heard the commotion. They lived next door, they heard this going on, rushed round, and she was badly beaten, but she was treated by a surgeon, she revived, and she said it was a man known as Hutty who had attacked her, and that was a chap called John Griffiths, worked at a nearby coal mine. He was about 22 years old. So he was rounded up, denied all knowledge of the attack, but she went to see him in custody, definitely him, and he was found guilty. So 22nd of March 1840, he was sentenced to 15 years transportation in Australia, and he sailed on the Eden, a convict ship, on her maiden voyage, one of 269 convicts on board. They set sail from England in July 1840, arrived in New South Wales in November 1840. And there were no records, certainly I didn't find any records showing that he ever returned to Oldham, so in all likelihood he, like the majority of others, stayed there and made a new life for him. And who knows, maybe there's an Australian family who have found our John Griffiths and are very happy to have found a convict to brag about. You never know. So, my penultimate section in tonight's talk, Masters of Execution. And I'm going to talk about one of Oldham's most maybe infamous sons, Albert Pierrepoint.
No.
But, no, I know he wasn't born in Oldham. Don't worry, I cover that. Roy keeps me on the straight and narrow. He's like, no, that's not quite right. But there's also another local executioner, you may or may not have heard of, a gentleman called Robert Leslie Stewart. He was Scottish, but he lived in Oldham. Known as Gentle Jack. He lived in Chatterton, and there's some very interesting stories about him. So hanging has always been the most widely used form of execution in Britain. It was introduced about 1,000 years ago by the Anglo-Saxons. I don't want to think about what people did before that. But the Anglo-Saxons came along and said, what we're going to do is going to hang everybody who does something wrong. But we took that on board. It became the most common form across the British Empire. And today, in many countries that were formerly part of the empire, or maybe still are, if they have the death penalty, hanging is by far the most widely used form of execution. So here in Britain, the death penalty for murder was suspended for 5 years in 1965, became permanent in 1969. But the death penalty for all crimes was only abolished in 1998. So between 1969 and 1998, you could, in theory, still have been hanged if you were convicted of piracy with violence, treason, and some military offences. Interesting. Luckily I commit none of those before 1998. So Albert Pierpoint, definitely the main man in the 20th century when it came to executions, but after he retired, Robert Leslie Stewart became one of the chief executioners in Britain. So I struggled to find a clear photo of him, which surprised me, given like his like job and how important he was. But this is Gentle Jack. So originally from Edinburgh, he moved to Chadderton in 1945 after serving in the RAF, and he was one of the last executioners in the UK working in the role between 1950 and 1964. He carried out the last execution in Wales, and he also hanged the last 18-year-old in England, a man called Francis Robert George Henry James Forsyth. He was hanged in November 1960, and yes, the legal age for hanging at the time was 18, but very few were, and there was an awful lot of expectation that he would be reprieved, but he wasn't. So he was the last 18-year-old to be hanged, and it was this gentleman who administered his punishment. And he was also jointly responsible for hanging the last 2 people in Great Britain, Peter Allen and Gwyn Evans, who were jointly convicted of murder, and they were each executed at 8 AM on the 13th of August 1964. Gwyn Evans at Strangeways by the other executioner Harry Allen, and Peter Allen at Walton Prison, Liverpool by our local Oldham executioner Roberts. And again, these were the last 2 in 1964 to be hanged, and they were already discussing the possibility of pausing the death sentence for murder. So again, there was an expectation they would be reprieved, but that didn't take place. So after the death penalty was abolished, he kind of lost his job. So he moved to South Africa, worked as an airline engineer. So what are your qualifications? I used to hang people. Probably with a Scottish accent, but I can't do that. And he died in 1988 at the age of 70. So, Albert, I assume it is Pierpoint, maybe it's a fancy way of saying it. But one thing you need to know about this man, like Churchill, rarely seen with that cigar in his mouth. Always had a cigar. So, we do claim him as one of our own, but he was not an Oldham native. He was born in Yorkshire in 1905, but when he was 12, in 1917, the family moved to Failsworth. His father's health was declining, so he left school and worked at Failsworth Marlborough Mills, which had been built in 1915. So that's where our man Albert worked as a youngster. Now, some might say that he was born to do the job that he's very famous for, because his father Henry had been an executioner, and so had his uncle Thomas, clearly ran the family. So his father Henry was an executioner between 1901 and 1910, and became the country's principal executioner in 1905, and he carried out around 105 executions, but he liked to drink. And in 1910, he turned up the day before an execution in Chelmsford, the worse for drink, and picked a physical fight with his assistant. So they said, thank you, but no thank you. And they decided he was no longer suitable to hold on to his position. And interestingly, executioners weren't fired. You didn't lose your job. You were just never invited to do an execution again. So poor old drunken Henry wasn't invited. They were like, you're going to pick fights with people instead of executing. We don't want you. Okay. So yes, he was never invited to work in that capacity. Uncle Tom, he lasted longer. He was an executioner between 1906 and 1946. He was never principal executioner. He performed about 294 hangings, including 13 that he did in America during World War II. So after leaving the mill, Albert worked as a delivery driver mainly. He became manager of a delivery business, but in 1931 he applied to become an assistant executioner and was turned down. Not for any question marks over his abilities, there were no jobs available. But 6 months later there was an opening and he was offered the job, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now the going rate of pay as an assistant executioner at the time was £1, 1 shilling and 6p. That was paid when you carried out the execution. And if your behaviour and conduct was satisfactory, you got the same amount paid to you 2 weeks later. So we'll assume Dad didn't get his second payment after the debacle at Chelmsford. And Albert did his first execution in December 1932 as an assistant to his uncle Tom. Now he continued working as the manager of the delivery business until after the war, when he took over the licence of a pub many of us may know about. Help the Poor Struggler. This was on Manchester Road in Hollingwood. You got it there. But sadly, no longer exists. And I can't even say, oh, it was pulled down in the 50s or whatever. It was in the 1990s that they pulled it down to make way for...
next door to it.
You didn't?
Yeah.
Oh, here?
No, the bowling, there was a pub next door called the Spinner's Arms.
Wow.
Because he had a sign over the pub and it said no hanging around the bar.
Lots of spinners.
Yeah, I can believe that. I can believe that. But yeah, when they were doing work for the M60, they knocked it down, and I just, this is like, but you know, honestly, I go onto a soapbox because Oldham's good at this. You know, lots of places have, like Bircham Bower, there's so many stately homes and manor houses in Oldham that have just been knocked down over the years. And okay, this is a pub, but I mean, come on, what a pub. What a pub. Yeah, so it was pulled down. Rather infamously, one of his friends at the pub, who he sang duets at the piano with, ended up seeing Albert, the other side to Albert, shall we say, not just the friendly local guy who ran the pub. So it was a man called James Corbett, and he murdered his girlfriend in a hotel in Ashton, and was sentenced to death. And the man conducting the execution was Albert. And he reflected afterwards, Albert reflected afterwards, that really, if anyone had had a deterrent to commit murder, it was James Corbett, who sung duets with the man responsible for executing those who did so. You know? But yeah. So Albert worked as executioner until 1956, and he became principal executioner like his father in 1940. So his total number of executions is unclear, but it was over 600. So this talk isn't about murderers. It's not about the stories of those that he executed. But some of the most notorious murders at the time, or in British history, met their end at his hands. So Ruth Ellis, the last woman hanged in Britain in 1955. Timothy Evans, a devastatingly sad story. He was hanged in 1950 for the murder of his wife and baby daughter. But 3 years later, Albert hanged John Christie, who was his landlord, who had actually committed the murders. So Timothy Evans did get a royal pardon in 1966. But interestingly, despite, or maybe because of, his career, Albert later reflected he was not sure he believed the death penalty was actually a good thing. He certainly didn't believe it had ever acted as a deterrent, and he wrote in his 1974 autobiography, "All the men and women whom I have faced at that final moment convince me that in what I have done, I have not prevented a single murder." That said, I did like the response of his longtime assistant Sid Durnley in his own 1989 autobiography. So referring to what Albert had said, Sid wrote, when you have hanged more than 680 people, it's a hell of a time to find out you do not believe capital punishment is Jesus. I think it's a fair point. And so now on to the last part of this evening's talk. It's just a very short story, and it's sad, but it's heartwarming, and it's a local Bardsley lad, okay? So Wild, it is, what was, a very common surname in Bardsley, and one that I've come across time and time again. No matter what I'm researching for local Bardsley history, I will come across not just Lees. Oh, I always come across the Lees. But there's various Dobbs, Ashton, but Wild is a very common one as well. And George and Rebecca Lees lived in Bardsley in the second half of the 19th century. In 1881, they lived at 168 Ashton Road, which is actually, it says Bardsley, but it's kind of near the Friends restaurant, going up towards Oldham. Prior to that, in the 1871 census, they lived at 181 Bardsley Hibbert's houses. And I haven't found out yet where that was, but I know there was a Hibbert's farm down Knott Lanes. Don't know if that's anything to do with it, but it's not on my old maps, Bardsley Hibbert's houses. So it's somewhere local. So they lived in Bardsley with their 6 sons and 2 daughters. They had a 7th son, Spencer, but he sadly died at the age of 5 months in 1869. So why am I mentioning them at the end of this talk? Well, because this gravestone in our churchyard caught my eye a few years ago. It's very overgrown, so I just pulled the ivy back a little bit. But when I first saw it a few years ago, it wasn't really overgrown. And it's got this inscription, so just here, it says, Joseph Nathan, their deeply lamented son, who lost his life in attempting to save that of a fellow creature in the Bardsley Canal on 17th day of August 1884 in the 24th year of his age. Which is just really sad. So I think that is 19th century talk where it says fellow creature. I think they mean a human being. You know, but this young lad, 23 or 24, Joseph, Wild, Bardsley lad, tried to save someone in distress in the canal and he died himself. And I've not found, again, any further details. I don't know who he saved, whether he managed to save them. But, you know, his parents must have had some comfort in what a brave young man he was. And I've wanted to mention him in one of my talks for a while, but he didn't work down a coal mine and he didn't work in a hospital, didn't work at Parkridge, he wasn't a woman suffragette. So I've been like, where can I mention him? And I thought it would be fitting to finish tonight's talk. So that's it. That is my talk. Thank you all so very much. You know, I had a lot of fun putting this one together. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much. I haven't decided yet what next month's talk's going to be, but I can tell you November's, because I did last year, I've researched all the names on the War Memorial. So I'm doing that because I'll be doing that talk just before Armistice Day. So I'll be doing that in November. December's one is going to be a fun frolic through, because I did Christmas last year, I'm doing New Year's Eve this year, and there's some really cool stuff in that one. So remember, it's the first Thursday, but next month I haven't quite decided, but I will put it on the local Facebook Bardsley page once I've got that sorted. We've got a few options, but I really hope to see you guys there. Thank you.
Sunday is our local PCSO, and he's organised this police surgery for us. So please make an effort to turn up, talk. You can talk in private, can't you, Sunday in the office?
Yeah, in the office, yeah.
Or we can talk in here, and there's corners that we're using here and stuff. So tell you, it'll go on Facebook after tonight.
What time?
It's 11 till 12 on the Monday, the 23rd September. But it's a really good chance to talk. There's a whole team coming in Sunday. A whole team of police is coming. It's not just the PCSO, the proper, not you know what I mean.
Your boss is coming.
His boss is coming.